First of all, I just want to thank you all for coming here today. It's a really interesting field and business, energy. The way prices move, it's a commodity business. Obviously, I've been in this business my whole life, and I like to say that the business reinvents itself every 4 or 5 years in some way, and that's what makes it interesting, and that's what gives us opportunity for those companies that are willing to look forward and move with those changes and change how their businesses operate and strive to be the best. There's an opportunity to make a lot of money. So I want to just start with some prepared remarks here. Warren, first of all, thank you very much. You may have heard that amid the lowest prices in years, the U.S. oil industry faces some steep economic hurdles over the next 12 to 24 months. We're hoping that. A barrel of Brent crude, which topped $115 in June of last year, is now trading below $50 a barrel. The slump in prices has forced a number of companies and service providers to cut jobs, cancel or postpone projects, and shrink their budgets. And while there are those who see U.S. Energy's glass as half empty, others see opportunities to leverage new technology and innovative ideas to create efficiencies that will propel us forward. One of the visionary leaders who sees those opportunities is today's featured speaker, Ryan Lance, the chairman and CEO of ConocoPhillips, the world's largest independent exploration and production company. Over a career that spans more than 30 years, Ryan has navigated through the industry's numerous peaks and valleys. He understands that, in our business, change is a constant. And the overarching lesson he has taken away from those experiences is that change fuels both progress and achievement, which have been part of Ryan's makeup for a long time. The son of an Air Force pilot, Ryan lived all over the U.S. while growing up, but spent most summers in the family farm near Wolf Point, Montana. He started out as roughnecking on oil rigs in high school and developed an enduring passion for the industry in the process. He put himself through college at Montana Tech by driving water trucks and working on drilling rigs, earning a petroleum engineering degree in 1984. After college, Ryan took a job with the Atlantic Richfield Company, ARCO. He stayed with ARCO for 17 years, becoming vice president of Western North Slope operations in Alaska. Those assets were acquired in 2001 by Phillips Petroleum, which a year later merged with Conoco to form ConocoPhillips. Over the ensuing years, Ryan's responsibility for international exploration and production took him around the world, including Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. In mid-2012, he became chairman and CEO of ConocoPhillips. To give you a sense of the size of the organization he leads, ConocoPhillips is number 4 on the Fortune 500 with $32 billion in annual revenue, $112 billion of total assets, and more than 18,000 employees as of June 30, 2015. As head of one of the world's largest energy companies, Ryan understands the enormous value in maintaining a diverse energy supply, and there's perhaps no better example of the need for diversification than here in New England, where the retirement of aging electricity plants and generating facilities are creating a significant debate in how to fill that void. Whether it's proposed Northeast Energy Direct Pipeline or the range of other projects under consideration, low-cost energy is integral to the economic future of this region. And because it's impossible to predict which source of energy ultimately will prove the most cost-effective, it is imperative that we maintain a diverse energy supply that includes access to liquid petroleum products, as well as renewables, natural gas, and nuclear. The region's businesses and consumers, and those looking to make New England their home, deserve no less. As Ryan has said, we have the resources in this country to continue the energy renaissance. Ryan's leadership style can be described with the acronym SAM: Set Direction, Align, and Motivate. It defines his commitment to move his organization in a direction that is compelling not only for his employees, but also for his company's shareholders. He understands the importance of trusting his leadership team, holding people accountable, and setting aspirational goals. Ryan is a consummate leader, whether as advocating on behalf of new safety measures or working to persuade Congress that allowing U.S. crude oil exports will serve as a stabilizing force in world markets. He has told the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources earlier this year, "We are an industry of scientists and engineers focused on finding solutions to very complex challenges while emphasizing safety and environmental protection." In talking with Ryan, it's clear to me that few people have a greater understanding of the oil and gas industry, better command of government energy policy, or a greater passion for ensuring this country's energy security. Please join me in welcoming the Chairman and CEO of ConocoPhillips, Ryan Lance. Ryan?
Well, there goes half my speech. Well done, Eric. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here today. Such an august group and CEOs in the room, and up here an important part of certainly the world economy and what goes on up in the Boston area. So I know Warren runs a pretty tight ship, I'm told. So I was looking for the trap door or the hook here, but I'll try to get through some comments really briefly and then really open it up for questions and answers, because I think that's some of the more fun that we can have here today. So Eric described my background a little bit, growing up in a rural farm in Montana, put myself through school and became a petroleum engineer, what I affectionately refer in our company as cement heads. So we're the guys that try to design and build things to get more oil and gas out of the ground. But I've also lived, as he mentioned, and traveled quite a bit internationally. Just like our company, we're in about 25 countries around the world, so I've learned to take a pretty global view of energy issues today, because I've seen the poverty and the hardship caused by energy scarcity, but I've also experienced cities overseas with terrible pollution problems in their country. So we take our role very seriously and believe we have multiple responsibilities in this space to really abundantly supply energy, but make it affordable and make it long-term, but also have to do that in a sustainable manner. I know the discussion that I've had with folks at the table here and today, has talked around the boom and the bust of the gas cycle, and Eric referred to it as well. I think it's appropriate because that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, the booms, the busts, but also the sustainability in navigating today's energy landscape. So I'll talk to you a few things today, some characteristics of the industry we find ourselves in, what caused the downturn that we're currently in, how companies like mine and others are responding to that, what's that long-term future of oil and gas, and how is it going to be done sustainably. And then I want to close with a few comments on oil exports, so hopefully you'll bear with me through that. So speaking of navigating, if anybody has a GPS that can plot a course through the business cycles, I certainly want one. I don't, because $100 oil is pretty easy, and $50 oil is very, very difficult in this business. In fact, I just read a report recently from a Credit Suisse analyst about the current downturn. It seems those who presume the world economy is benefiting from today's lower oil prices are probably mistaken. The analyst looked at commodity-related capital investments. They make up about 30% of the global capital investments today. And oil and gas downturn has impacted that. Cutbacks and, of course, other commodities have impacted that as well. Altogether, these reductions have cut both the U.S. and the global gross domestic product growth. And that impact has been about a full percentage point just over the last 12 months. And that's quite an economic hit. As it turned out, the cut in oil demand growth has also slowed down the rebalancing of the market, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, my 31 years in this industry, there have been several incredible booms and busts in the business. And it's interesting is I don't know many other businesses in the world that have had to endure a over 60% drop in your revenues over the course of 6 months' time. And that's what this industry has gone through. Now, in the past, we've dealt with hurricanes, with geopolitical events, and concerns that have also cut the supplies available to meet the demand. But more importantly now, we've recently seen an innovation that have brought new supplies online. and that's the energy renaissance that's going on here in the U.S., and that's occurred over these past 10 years. It was unexpected, and it's also been transformational, not only for our industry and our company, but I think for the U.S. economy as well. On the drive from the airport to the hotel last night, I noticed some of the gas prices here in the Boston area in the low $2 a gallon, U.S. $2 a gallon. You know, if you think back, that's on an inflation-adjusted basis, that's 37 cents in 1970 dollars. So the good old times are here again. And oil industry technology really had a lot to do with that, and I'll share you some facts about that. You know, first, our industry, people don't give us a lot of credit for being a high-tech industry, but we really do rival NASA in both complexity and leading-edge technology. A couple examples. Just to process our seismic data in our company, we own one of the world's top 20 supercomputers. It has 2.9 petaflops of capacity. Now, like you, I don't know what a petaflop is, but in understandable terms, it performs 3 trillion calculations and operations every second. That's how big that computer is. We also run those models on our subsurface reservoir performance, the engineering designs that we do, and clearly the economic simulations and a lot more. Our workforce is pretty talented. I was looking up, you know, what in terms of Harvard, MIT, and Boston College do we have, and we've got over 1,000 employees in our company that come from just those 3 schools around the world, and most of them have advanced degrees in master's and PhD. We've also assumed a massive amount of mechanical capability in the company as well, like horizontal and directional drilling. And to just give you an example, you can start at MIT, you can drill down a mile, you can come over here, and I can have that bit pop up in the middle of this lectern on this stage. And that's the technology that we're employing in this business. It's truly remarkable. And we've become a pretty large job creation engine in the world in the U.S. today. Last month, our company celebrated a startup in Canada. It took 48 million man-hours to build that facility, and at peak, we had over 5,000 people on site, and they all performed admirably and safely. So the business, it needs to have reliability, and it's incredibly complex. But there are some challenges that are unique to this business. For example, the natural reservoir declines that we have. So as you produce from a reservoir deep underneath the ground, the pressure goes down, and that production declines, typically 9% every year. So we have to run pretty hard, we have to reinvest heavily just to stay flat, let alone to grow our business. And it's highly capital intensive. Last year, our company invested nearly $17 billion. That's about $900,000 per employee. So it's a business of big numbers. It's big assets, big capital expenditures, big operating expenses, and sometimes pretty good profits, certainly during the good times. But we're also fiercely competitive, and the business is highly fragmented. There are several thousand independent operators and producers. Some are small, some are quite small, some are large like ConocoPhillips. And we compete against each other. We compete against our far larger integrated competitors, and you know the famous names there. But the true giants in our business are the national oil companies. And those are the ones owned by overseas governments, like Aramco in Saudi Arabia and Pemex in Mexico. But today, we find ourselves in an oversupplied market. And a big reason for that oversupply is U.S. liquids production. It's up 5 million barrels a day just since 2008. Meanwhile, we found an abundant supply of natural gas. When you take U.S. and Canada combined, those 2 countries now have control over a century of gas, 100 years of gas supply. That abundance was long thought impossible. North American oil and gas were considered mature, we were in decline, and even some called our industry a sunset industry. But the recent growth and job creation that really helped lead the U.S. out of the 2008 recession. Now, if I get back to the market for a minute, there are some other factors in the oversupply. Energy demand growth is weak. That's because that economic growth has slowed down in China, in many of the developing countries around the world. Meanwhile, energy efficiency standards are rising for cars and trucks, for appliances, for housing, and for commercial buildings. So that combination of supply growth and weak demand has driven the oil prices down over half where they were a year ago. And OPEC, usually the throttle, has refused to cut production to rebalance the market. Take, for example, Saudi Arabia. Today they account for 1/3 of OPEC's production, and they've increased their output in order to maintain their market share in the globe. These low oil prices have certainly impacted us here at home in the U.S. Our liquids production has turned down, and that's the first time it's done that since 2008. Today, we have only 800 rigs working in the U.S. onshore. That's down from over 1,900 just 1 year ago. And many areas just aren't economic at $45 oil, which is what U.S. crude is selling for today. And I think the rig count reflects that. But there's still drilling that is occurring in the sweet spots, the best of the best opportunities in these shale fields. You might recognize some of the names, like the Eagle Ford and the Permian Basin in Texas and the Bakken in North Dakota. So the energy renaissance isn't over, it's just kind of slowed down. So meanwhile, North American natural gas remains a bargain. So gas is the leading source, certainly here in Massachusetts, one of the top choices for home heating here. And the cost to your consumers in this state have fallen by nearly half since 2008. So CEOs of and company offers, you might ask, how do we succeed in this volatile cyclic business? Well, the quick answer is you got to cut your costs and you got to improve your efficiency. Both are really badly needed. You know, over the last 4 to 5 years, the service costs in our business grew by a factor of 4. So while production or the price of crude doubled maybe over that same time frame, our costs went up by a factor of 4. So the capital budgets now are falling industry-wide. In our company, we've cut nearly a third out of our capital budget. We're focusing on projects that deliver a low cost of supply. That's essential for profitability today. And we have gone through some tough time and lost some jobs. I certainly have had to say goodbye to some longtime friends and coworkers in this business. And certainly that's not easy. It's not easy in any business. But our near-term strategy is ensuring capital flexibility. That means we can ramp up or ramp down our spending depending on the response that we get from the price signals. We have cut back in some areas like deep water. Exploration and development there can take 10 years, as well as billions of dollars of capital. But in our company, we're focused on shorter cycle time projects like onshore shale wells that we can ramp up and ramp down over the course of months, not over the course of years. Our view is that responsive companies will come out of the downturn stronger than those who move slowly. But even as we respond to today, we're mindful of the long term. I'm going to share some insights about the longer term. Today, the world oil demand's running at about 93 million barrels a day. The oversupply that I talked to reduce demand and increase supply is only running at about 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day. That's about 1/5 of the surplus we saw in the last boom and bust cycle in the 1990s. So the market can rebalance itself much faster. And some of that surplus is already bleeding away. You know, historically, low prices have forced cutbacks in investments. We're seeing that now. Drilling goes down. We're seeing that today. It reduces production, as I've mentioned. And meanwhile, low oil prices tend to stimulate demand. And historically, that combination of events starts to soak up that surplus. So low oil prices do sow the seeds of the next upcycle. And we can also experience geopolitical events, unrest in areas or wars. They can take oil off the market, and they could drive an upcycle that way too. On the other hand, we see some counteracting events, like more oil coming on stream from Iraq and from Iran that can depress the market. So you can see we've got a lot of moving parts in this business. And typically, we're going to see scenarios that plan out that are a combination of all those different scenarios. Certainly, particularly if OPEC continues with their decision not to reduce production to rebalance the market. But onshore production here in the U.S. is going to cycle up and down in response to those price signals. And it would be the responding sort of supply and demand shifts and those price signals that are going to drive the amount of production coming from the U.S. So the production here is pretty resilient. It's a relatively short cycle time, and that's due to the high resource potential we have for shale here in the U.S., and that production can ramp up fairly quickly, and it'll be limited by the price shocks that we see. In fact, our recent increase in production that we've seen since 2008 has helped hold global oil prices down. It's offset many of the big disruptions we've seen in the Middle East and in North Africa. And some economists have said it's saved U.S. consumers at the gas pump $1 per gallon just over that time frame as production ramped up in the U.S. So again, I'll take the GPS and I'll take the crystal ball if you got a crystal ball that will help you predict commodity prices. I want one of those as well. But you say, how do you manage through this? It's a pretty volatile time. And why even worry about oil and gas? Because renewable energy will take over. In fact, it will play a major role in the future energy mix for the globe. And we do expect continued technology improvements in that space. But today we're a world of 7 billion people, Estimates have us growing as a world to 9 billion people by 2040, and we're going to need all the energy sources to fuel that economy. The IHS here in Boston has studied the time spans historically required for meaningful energy infrastructure change. So, for example, replacing a fleet of electric power plants takes 40 years. Replacing a shipping fleet takes 25 years. Heating systems take 20 years. Vehicles, light vehicles, even take 15 years to replace the market. So building major scale infrastructure from scratch can cost hundreds of billions of dollars, even trillions of dollars, and it happens gradually. And that's even with pretty dramatic technological changes. Take the changeover from hardwired telephones to cell phones. That's taken almost 50 years. And there are still growing pains. And we still don't have cell phones that work everywhere. So that's an indication how long it takes to flip that infrastructure. And that's why natural gas is so important to the energy mix today. First, as a major source itself, and second, gas-fired power plants are highly flexible. They're needed to back up the intermittent solar and wind power that we're producing. New energy sources like this typically take a half a century or more to assume a major scale. Meanwhile, demand generally remains high for the older sources, or even increases. Both the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and the IHS have studied the energy mix required by 2040. They examined scenarios that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and that would limit the global expansion of temperature to the 2 degrees Celsius that the IPCC endorses. They concluded in that study that renewable energy must grow, and it's going to grow from 13% of the supply today and will grow to 35% by 2040. Now, obviously, the use of fossil fuels will fall on a proportionate basis, but we're at 82% of the global energy supply today, and we'd wind up over half the global energy supply by 2040. So all pieces are needed as part of this solution. Now, I've mentioned we believe that our responsibilities extend to ensuring sustainability and environmental stewardship. We've reduced our air, water, and land footprint. We've reduced our emissions. We're expanding water treatment so we can reuse and recycle. We're siting multiple wells on a pad so we can reduce our footprint. And regarding climate change, we recognize that human activity is attributing to the increase in concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We've held our emissions flat since 2009 despite rising production. We've taken 6 million metric tons of emissions out of the system. Nationwide, in the electric utility sector, natural gas has displaced a lot of coal. And by comparison, natural gas has a lot to offer. It emits little nitric oxide and sulfur dioxide. They contribute to acid rain and smog, and virtually no soot. So using natural gas in power generation instead of coal cuts greenhouse gas emissions in half. And as a result, U.S. emissions have fallen to early 1990 levels. You know, we didn't sign the Kyoto Protocol as a country. We're the only nation in the world that's met the requirements of the Kyoto Protocol. And how has that happened? Through natural gas production and increases in the United States. So as we think about this uncertain world, you know, we incorporate a lot of that into our market planning and the scenarios that we look at. We assume carbon constraints. We think we're going to get more stringent requirements from government, and we want to prepare for those possibilities. Now, as you can surmise, we obviously disagree as well with the divest fossil fuels environment. Got a lot of its roots here in Boston. That forced the major institutions around the world to sell their stocks in publicly owned oil and gas companies. But you think about it, their math is flawed, and their rationale is a little bit flawed. Of the top 50 companies in the world today, the IOCs, we represent only 6% of the world's remaining potential emissions from fossil fuels. That's even in considering the 2-degree scenario. We're small compared to the national oil companies, and we're also small compared to the coal reserves that are out there today. So we believe that industry, government, and consumers must recognize a key point. We'll all be interacting together for a long period of time. We need to find common ground on the issues, and we need to develop solutions together. We've had some success collaborating. We've worked with the EPA, the Bureau of Land Management. Beyond government, we work with our stakeholders concerned about carbon asset risk. We've learned from those exchanges, and the stakeholders have gained confidence in the approach. And hopefully we'll see greater collaboration going forward. And that brings me to my last point, where collaboration I think can help. And that's for years, we've advocated now the logical next step in the U.S. energy renaissance, and that's exporting domestic crude that cannot be economically processed today in U.S. refineries. Most exports from the U.S. have been banned since 1975, with only a few exceptions. That forces America to sell our crude at a discount to the already low discounted world price. Now, the discount's not passed on to the consumer because the refiners can trade their diesel and gasoline on global product prices. But the discount that discount is done to further decrease investment, is driven to decrease investment in both exploration and production. And that's hampered the national economy, as I mentioned earlier. Our industry over the last 6 months has lost some 200,000 jobs. And allowing exports would encourage renewed investment here at home, help save some of the existing jobs and create new ones, increase production of American oil, further improve the trade balance, generate tax revenue for the government, and importantly, it produces more savings to the consumers at the gas pump. Now, virtually all the studies by universities, think tanks, and even the government agree. There's strong bipartisan support in Congress. Now, if we can only get the administration to act. So that's my number one on my wish list over the next few months. So hopefully giving you some insights into the oil and natural gas industry, the challenges we face, what that energy renaissance means to our country, and the opportunities we have at hand and the path ahead. Oil and natural gas are foundational to the U.S. and the global economies. That's going to continue far into the future. But we recognize that oil and natural gas must be developed and used safely, cleanly, and sustainably. So we stand ready to do it on our part as a company, ready for that engagement and ready for that collaboration on all these points. So thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions. This is the fun part. Anybody? Oh. Sorry?
Go ahead.
One question just in terms of lifting the ban, the export ban. What do you think would happen to the price of WTI crude if the ban was lifted? Would it stay the same? Do you think it would change?
Yeah, so the question is, what would happen if the export ban was lifted to WTI crude, which is the marker with which U.S. American crude is sold at? Today, what we think would happen long term is it would equilibrate to a transportation differential relative to Brent crude, which is the other main key marker. So when you think about and Brent crude is a North Sea, UK, Norway crude marker. And so what's the transportation differential to get from the U.S. to the North Sea? You know, it runs about $1.50 to $2 a barrel. So you'd hope over time that the difference between those two would equilibrate there. The key flip side to that is our crude that we're producing in the U.S. is more valuable than Brent crude. It's a higher quality crude. So really, if all things being equal, it should sell at an advantage to Brent crude. So we would hope over time that quality would be recognized and further reduce that difference between that $2 transportation differential as well.
So during this renaissance, clearly supply has made a big difference, and you've alluded to fracking. Given the caveat that nobody has a crystal ball, what do you see the future of fracking in the U.S.? And B, what is the future with other countries, and how might that impact us?
Yeah, good question. So what's the future of fracking? So the confluence of technologies that have led to this energy renaissance is this combination of horizontal drilling that the industry has done for a long time, and this what's called hydraulic fracturing, which is pumping water and sand down into the reservoir deep in the ground to basically crack open the rock to allow the oil and gas to flow into a wellbore and be produced up at the surface. We've done both those technologies for years. Hydraulically fractured over 1 million wells in the U.S. since the 1950s. We've drilled horizontally for a long period of time. But the technology and the specialists in our business figured out how to put that together and drill very long horizontal wells in multiple stages of hydraulic fracture stimulation in the reservoir, and that's what's unlocked it. The future, I think, is really pretty bright. I mean, this confluence of technology is learned how to get oil out of rock that's as hard as this podium, that we didn't even think was possible. And in fact, our industry over the last 10 years, people haven't really put it in this kind of frame, but if you're familiar with the North Slope of Alaska, Prudhoe Bay, which is the largest discovery in the U.S. in the last 50 years, our industry's discovered 3 or 4 Prudhoe Bays in the last 10 years because of the technology that we're unlocking. So it's critical to be able to keep doing that technology, do it sustainably, recycle water so we can use it again in the process and reuse it. Now, as we go internationally, what's happened is we're not the only country blessed with this kind of geology. It will move internationally, but it's going to move slower because they don't have the fabulous infrastructure, the drilling rigs, the service industry that we have, and most importantly, they don't have private land ownership. The land is owned by the governments, and the governments are restricting the access, and they don't have the economic incentive. A person who lives on the land doesn't get any economic incentive for people that are coming to develop some of the resources that exist underneath their land. It will move internationally. It will go that way, but it's going to take a longer period of time, and it won't ramp up as quickly. But it will be a source of supply over time being 20, 30 years from now. Yes, sir, in the corner.
As our RAND deal looks like it's going to get finalized, you touched on it for a second there. Once it's finalized and moving forward, which it looks like that's the direction it's going, how is that going to impact prices? Because I've heard there's a lot of fear from folks like yourself in the oil industry that will bring prices down even further.
Yeah, so question, if for all that didn't hear, what about Iran coming into the market? The nuclear agreement signed, it looks like it'll get ratified, and they'll come back into the market. What impact is that going to have on prices? It's a little bit uncertain today. It doesn't look like OPEC is going to adjust any of their quotas. And Iran's going to come back, and they want to come back into pre-sanction levels. So that's up to 3 million barrels a day. Today they're producing a million and a half barrels a day. So it is going to have an impact. It's going to put softening pressure on prices. Clearly what the Saudi do, what do the Iraqis do in response to that, and it's a bit of an unknown. So all things being equal, it's going to put downward pressure on the price. The one bright spot that we're seeing is global demand has picked up because prices are low, and that should offset some of that requirement. The other thing our industry is doing is we're deferring all our investments that we can defer because of the low prices. You got to just live within your means and the cash flow that you have as a company. We're creating a supply bubble in 3 to 4 years. Because of all industry pushing their investments back, given the cycle times in our business, there will be supply impact to that down the road. So I think with growing demand, even letting Iran come back into the market, we see enough offsetting issues there that we'll see a slower recovery, but it'll probably take a longer period of time before we recover back to a price that is probably lower than where we were for the last 3 years at 90 to 95. We're going back to something lower. And I think we have to be prepared for more volatility. Why? Because of the North American energy renaissance here, our ability to ramp up production and slow down. We're becoming the swing producer. We're becoming the Saudi Arabia for the globe today. Back.
I'm kind of curious about your view about the U.S. having a national energy policy. And I'm not aware that we really have one, or if we do, it's become synonymous with climate change. I'm curious to your views on that.
Yeah, no, we don't have a national energy policy. We've got a patchwork of policies and regulations that some people would describe as a national energy policy, but we really don't. I don't think as a nation, we're well prepared for what's coming, both from the downstream, the upstream, the midstream. Eric talked about some of what his company is doing on the midstream side. The investment that we're going to be needed, just like in the highways, the investments we're going to need it in more pipelines. I think you guys are going through a debate up here. Just south of you and your neighbors, we've discovered some of the largest gas reserves in the Marcellus field in Pennsylvania that we have in this country as a whole. We flattened that supply curve. Those prices are going to remain low for a long period of time. It's a clean burning form of energy. How do you get that up here to the Northeast and get the infrastructure expanded to allow access to some of that low-cost energy? And I think those are pretty interesting kind of facts that we have to grapple with. Oil exports need to be addressed, gas exports. So despite the lack of an energy policy, look what's happened to emissions in the United States. I mentioned we've dropped to 1992 levels of CO2 in the atmosphere in the United States. That wasn't driven by energy policy. It had some attributes to it, certainly CAFE standards on cars, efficiency standards. So there have been some policy and regulations that have helped move that along, but there's been no cohesive energy policy around all the aspects, both the consumption of energy and the production of energy.
You noted early on that there's been a lot of controversy, especially around the greater Boston area, about oil and gas industry and holdings. And for those of us who have had to be engaged in those, either around our dinner table or in institutional settings, I wonder if you might want to take a moment just to talk about your strategy going forward and whether or not there is a notion of diversification and ways in which you might address issues like carbon sequestration and the like.
Yeah, so I think all will play an important role in that. So I tried to say that, you know, all energy is going to be needed. We have to improve the solar penetration, improve the technology. Wind is actually reasonably competitive today if you exclude intermittency effects, but you got to include intermittency effects. At the end of the day, the wind doesn't blow all the time everywhere. So we have to solve those problems, and I think the technology is working to do that. We have to recognize that the intermittency is a real problem. You got to pay for backup energy. How are you going to get that backup energy? We have to understand that you know, there are ways to deal with CO2, and sequestration is one of them. What we find is it's very, very expensive. And in fact, we don't have national and statewide regulations that allow us to do it everywhere. So does a state like Massachusetts want to take CO2 that was produced from a neighboring state and put it down into the ground? In a lot of cases, the answer is no. And so we have a long ways to go. And that's, again, part of a broader energy policy structure that would be very helpful for the country. But I think the answer at the end of the day, we need all the above. So I think the president's onto something there. It is all the above. It is, we need solar where solar works. We need wind where wind works. And we need oil and gas where oil and gas works. And we need nuclear where nuclear works. And we need coal where coal works. And we need clean coal. So I think it is a rational recognition that it is about all the above, but we have to do that responsibly and sustainably. What else? Yes, sir.
So I've been reading a little bit. Every time I add gasoline to my car, I see 10% of ethanol. And everything I've read says it's incredibly expensive to produce. The only way you can economically produce is through algae. I understand the farm politicians are going to make it so it's very difficult to get that. Why do we have the ethanol in gasoline?
Well, it's you know, its roots date back to you know, additives into the gasoline to make it burn cleaner, and you know, the MTB outlawed over the last few years, and ethanol's been the thing that's filled that void from an oxygenation and improvement in the gasoline mix. And there's a lot of studies going on around, you know, is wells to wheels, is the full impact of ethanol, is it an improvement or not? I think it has improved sort of the gasoline mix and been an opportunity to put more renewables into the fuel mix. I think the debate is how far do you go? Is 5 or 10%? Do you go to 15 or 20%? There's some amount that probably does make sense, but clearly you can take that overboard. And again, that goes back to policy decisions. I think what the EPA is trying to drive in terms of renewable and ethanol and trying to drive that into the gasoline pool is a bit flawed analysis, because there's not enough capacity to put it into the system right now. And no one has found third order cellulosic, or as you described, algae-based ethanol to be successful. It's incredibly expensive, and you can't do it at scale. I mean, we produce and consume quite a lot of gasoline, and you can't do that at scale. So ethanol, I think, has its advantages in certain areas. Again, you know, in the middle part of the country, it might make sense. Other places of the country, it probably doesn't make sense.
I wonder if you could speak for a moment, looking past bust. You mentioned in your opening comments that you've seen the effects of a lack of energy access and the poverty it can create. As ConocoPhillips thinks about opening new markets, thinks about the diversity of energy sources and the time that you mentioned infrastructure ramp-ups take, as you look at a new market and think about opening to other parts of the world to increase access, how does the diversity of energy and the infrastructure aspects take part in your thought process and approach and your strategy?
Yeah, I think a very good question. So as we go to some of the places around the world, we had a deep water discovery in Senegal. Senegal is a country that imports all of its energy today, has very little natural energy. And of course, if they can spur their development with oil and gas, it's something that they're very interested in doing. But they also recognize, it has to be a sustainable development. What other things can they do? But the advantage to them is it brings them revenues and it brings them opportunity, one, to build their infrastructure out and to start their diversification away from even just fossil fuels and some other opportunities. So it is very much about not just developing a field or an opportunity that we have. We know we're, in some cases, developing a country. We're helping to develop that country. And the industry's done this pretty well. You date back, 70, 80 years ago to Indonesia. One of the quality producers of oil and gas today that started out as a gas business, burning a lot of coal, found a bunch of gas, were able to convert their system from coal to natural gas. They were burning crude oil to power generation and now have turned that fleet over to natural gas. So you see that evolution, but it takes time. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of revenue, and it takes a lot of foreign direct investment. So they have to be competitive. They got to compete in a global world to get some of that investment coming. But countries like we do, we look for stability, we look for transparency, we look for rule of law, we look for the ability to have that kind of an influence before we go into some of these countries. Over here. Yep.
Good question. So, the world's largest energy consumer, China, for crude oil consumer, China is rolling out the new benchmark for crude. Why don't you just talk a little bit about how you think that's going to impact the markets, the price of crude, and so forth?
Yeah, so I think the question they're rolling, China, one of the largest consumers of crude, is rolling out a new benchmark for the crude. I don't think it's going to have a big impact. The crude is pretty fungible and traded in global commodities. So today, we have various benchmarks. We have Duri in the east. We have Saudi Arabian light. We have Saudi Arabian heavy. We have Brent. We have WTI. We have various markers here. So I don't think it's going to have a big influence, certainly in the market. They're going to try to tie it to some of their production that they have coming out of their country. But I think it's going to trade on a quality and a transportation differential like the rest of the crudes do. Good. Well, thank you. I truly appreciate the time you had. Thank you.